The clatter of iron heels on cobblestones sounded exactly like a musket being cocked, sharp, decisive, lethal, and it froze Louis Capet, the man who still insisted on calling himself king, in the middle of a back-alley Paris butcher shop that reeked of blood and sawdust. Above the gutted hogs swinging from hooks, a single gutter lamp hissed, casting a jaundiced glow over the monarch's borrowed coat, coarse brown wool stiff with another man's sweat. The disguise itched like penance, but it wasn't the fleas biting his skin that made him tremble. It was the knowledge that one wrong glance could send a mob howling for his head. Outside, the city pulsed with revolutionary fever. Church bells told the curfew Louis himself had once decreed. Now they tolled for him like premature funeral chimes. Somewhere beyond the butcher's window, someone shouted Liberté, and another voice answered with "A la lanterne," a promise that any discovered traitor would be strung up on the nearest street lamp. A third voice began to sing the Ca Ira, the marching dirge of vengeance. The melody wound through the night air, slipping beneath the door and coiling around Louis's throat. Marie Antoinette stood beside him, cheeks chalk white beneath soot smeared on for camouflage. Her wig, once a tower of jeweled birds and candied ribbons, was gone, replaced by a ragged bonnet that smelled of wood smoke. She gripped their 8-year-old son's hand so tightly his knuckles blanched. Little Louis Charles, hair shorn like a prison convict, fought to keep from coughing at the coppery stench of carcasses. Even the Dauphin understood silence was safer than truth. The plan, if you could call it that, had been spun in hushed, panicked meetings inside the Tuileries palace. Dress the royal family as a bourgeois household, ride at midnight to the eastern gate, rendezvous with loyal dragoons, then race toward the fortress town of Montmedy, where Austrian cannon could shield them until France tired of its rebellion. The plot reeked of desperation, whispers swirling like sewer gas through corridors lined with gold leaf. But Louis, trapped between hungry Parisians and treacherous courtiers, clung to it like a drowning man to rotted planks. Now those planks splintered. Through the butcher's doorway strode a patrol of National Guardsmen, bayonets glinting under the weak lamp. Their leader, Captain Drouet, the postmaster of Varennes turned revolutionary bloodhound, wore a tricorn hat dusted with travel grime. He held up a playing card, the king's face from a deck seized at the palace months earlier. The caricature bore a bulbous nose, sagging jowls, and the unmistakable smallpox scars. Drouet's eyes flicked from the card to Louis, then back. Recognition flared like flint striking powder. Blood roared in Louis's ears. Sweat prickled beneath the fake sideburns pasted to his cheeks. He had shaved his royal whiskers that very afternoon, comforting himself that a bare chin would make him invisible. But a monarch never learns invisibility. His vanity glows even through rags. Marie drew in a breath that sounded like ripping silk. In that span of one heartbeat, Louis could almost hear Versailles fountains gurgling in the distance, smell the orangery in bloom, taste the sugared violets the queen once scattered across linen tablecloths. All those gilded memories now shriveling like grapes left to rot on the vine. Drouet took a single step forward. "Citizen," he said, voice low but slicing, "what is your business out so late with wife and child in tow?" He emphasized citizen, as if testing the title's fit on royal shoulders. Louis tried to answer, but his tongue stuck to the roof of his mouth, dry as parchment. The boy whimpered. Marie squeezed his hand. Her own lips moved silently, perhaps praying, perhaps cursing. The chandeliers of Versailles had never illuminated a silence this loud. A pig carcass swung between Louis and the captain, oozing fat that dripped onto Louis's borrowed boots. The smell made him gag, the sight made him shiver. Kings are pigs, Paris pamphleteers had screeched for months, and here he was, hidden among boiling lard and bone saws, proving the metaphor true. Louis managed a hoarse whisper. We are traveling to meet family in Lorraine. Our carriage broke a wheel." Every word tasted like rust and cowardice. He hated the tremor in his voice, hated the way his eyes darted toward the back door where a coach waited, curtained and unmarked. Drouet did not blink. He raised a lantern. Its flame danced across Louis's face, highlighting the unmistakable Habsburg lip, the weak chin beneath the false whiskers, the uncertain eyes of a man expecting judgment. Slowly, almost respectfully, Drouet turned the playing card so the butcher's wife, now peering from behind a blood-spattered counter, could compare drawing to flesh. Her gasp sliced the tension like a cleaver. She dropped her knife. It clanged against the tiles, echoing like a guillotine's fall. A distant shout answered the clatter. "Soldats par ici." Footsteps thundered, then multiplied. The alley outside filled with steel, torchlight, and rage. Louis looked to Marie. For the first time since their wedding, she did not look back with admiration or playful reproach. She looked at him as one prisoner looks at another when the warden's keys jangle outside the cell. The boy began to cry. And still, part of Louis's mind drifted to an absurd detail. In the chaos of leaving the palace, he had forgotten to pack his favorite pocket watch, the one engraved with Mercury and the inscription Tempus Fugit, Regnum Mane, time flies, the kingdom endures. How bitterly the watch would mock him now, its silver hands spinning toward an executioner's dawn. Captain Drouet drew his saber, point lowering to Louis's chest. "By order of the National Assembly," he declared, voice swelling to pierce the alley, "I detain you, Louis Capet, for crimes against the people of France." Blood drained from Louis's face. Outside, torches flared, bayonets lifted. The chanting began, first one voice, then 10, then 100, rolling through the streets like a thunderstorm eager for lightning. "A Paris! A Paris! A la guillotine!" Louis felt his knees betray him. The magnificent hallways of Versailles, the perfumed corridors of absolute power, the marble balustrades where courtiers bowed, every inch of it crumbled in his imagination, replaced by this butcher's shop of coagulating truth. Captain Drouet nodded toward the door, saber still poised. "Your carriage awaits, sire," he said, letting the final title drip with irony. "But its destination has changed. We ride not to Montmedy, but back to the people who trusted you with their future." The butcher's wife crossed herself. The boy sobbed harder. Marie closed her eyes. And Louis XVI, once called the most Christian king, stepped forward under the gleam of a soldier's blade, knowing the road ahead was paved not with cobblestones or courtiers' whispers, but with the cold rattle of a tumbril passing over Paris sewers on its way to the scaffold. The carriage lurched into the moon-slick street, wheels rattling like dice shaken by a spiteful god. Louis, Marie, and the trembling Dauphin were forced onto the rear bench while Captain Drouet and two riflemen wedged opposite, sabers across their knees. A third guard perched on the footboard, musket leveled through the window slit, barrel glinting each time a torch roared past. Outside, the mob swarmed around the coach in a fevered tide. Clockmakers, washerwomen, half-starved apprentices, every fist clutching a pike, every throat spitting slogans that tasted of sour wine and vengeance. Each jolt drove the king's spine against splintered wood. He clutched the Dauphin's shoulders, trying to hush the child's hiccuping sobs, but the boy smelled the same fear pooling under his father's borrowed coat. Marie's bonnet had slipped, revealing strands of hair once perfumed with jasmine, now matted by sweat. She stared at her husband, blue eyes reduced to 2 chips of Arctic ice. In that silence, Louis felt years of marital distance solidify into a wall thicker than the Bastille's stones. Only now both prisoners sat on the same side, condemned together. They crossed the Pont de la Concorde at dawn. Mist rose off the Seine, ghost-gray, cloaking the towers of Notre Dame. Somewhere a church bell tolled prime, but its holiness fractured against the crowd's chant. "Coupez Louis la tête!" Cut off his head. Louis's throat tightened. He had once ordered bells rung to announce royal births. Now they seemed to count the remaining beats of his pulse. Drouet leaned forward, voice a growl only the carriage could hear. "Do you smell it, Capet? That's the odor of skin tanned by hunger. You fed Versailles pastries while Paris gnawed on hope." His breath reeked of stale tobacco, yet the words stabbed sharper than bayonets. Louis opened his mouth, perhaps to beg, perhaps to justify, but the coach lurched and a bag of stones slammed the door with splintering. Pebbles poured onto the Dauphin's lap. The child whimpered, brushing at blood that was not yet his. Marie pulled him close, her whisper a venom-soft hiss. "Hold your head high. They shall not teach you to cower." Yet her own hands shook as though winter lived beneath her skin. At the Rue Saint-Honoré, the procession slowed. A barricade of overturned carts and shattered wine barrels clogged the way, manned by ragged soldiers of the National Guard. Their commander, a thin-featured lawyer named Antoine Renaud, raised a clenched fist. "Search the royal baggage," he shouted. Hands yanked open the traveling trunks lashed atop the coach. Out spilled silk gowns, lace cuffs, a gold leaf icon of St. Louis. Proof, Renaud sneered, that the king fled with treasures while citizens starved. The crowd howled as soldiers brandished each trinket like severed trophies. Then came a discovery that turned howls into animal roars. A strongbox splintered under a bayonet to reveal diamond earrings, each stone sparking dawn's first light. Louis recognized them instantly, Marie's favorite teardrops of Vienna. A fruit seller lifted one to the sky, its facets spraying rainbows onto faces smeared with soot. Rainbows, Louis thought bitterly. hope refracted through blood. A stone whizzed through the window, grazing his temple. Warmth trickled down his cheek, the Dauphin screamed. Through ringing ears Louis heard a single pistol shot. Smoke curled near the barricade. A butcher fell, clutching his thigh. Chaos erupted, screams, trampling feet, rifle stocks smashing cobbles. Louis felt the weight of every death yet to come settle on his shoulders like a cloak woven from lead. Drouet slammed the coach door. "Drive on," he barked. The driver cracked his whip. The carriage smashed through the barrier, wheels crunching glass, sparks spitting from iron rims. Inside, the king pressed a kerchief to his bleeding temple, the fabric blooming crimson like a rose of Versailles gone rabid. Marie tore a strip from her petticoat to stanch the flow, her fingers finally steady, as though Louis realized she'd prepared for this moment all her life. Outside the window, Paris transformed into a gauntlet of betrayed faces. Bakers raised rolling pins like clubs. Schoolboys pelted the coach with inkwells. An old nun crossed herself then spat, eyes blazing with judgment usually reserved for the devil. Each street they turned onto seemed narrower, darker, as if the city itself were folding in to swallow the royal fugitives. By mid-morning the carriage rolled onto the Place du Carrousel. The Tuileries palace loomed ahead, bayonet tips glinting along its roofline like a crown of thorns. Gone were the silk-draped balconies where perfume once drifted on summer breezes. Now soot streaked the stone, and red and black banners snapped like flayed skin. The crowd parted just enough to let the coach crawl forward, citizens climbing lampposts for a better view of the fallen monarch. When the door was yanked open, the stench of unwashed bodies hit with physical force. Drouet exited first, saber raised to command silence. None came. He turned, extended a calloused hand toward the king, not in deference, but to haul livestock from a cart. Louis hesitated only a second before grasping it. The gesture drew jeers, as if witnessing the last shred of royal dignity being auctioned off. Boots hit the cobbles. A boy with a slingshot fired an acorn at Louis's knee. Pain flared, petty yet humiliating. Marie descended next, gaze sweeping the mob like searchlights, daring anyone to strike her child. The Dauphin followed, clutching a toy wooden soldier someone had thrust at him hours earlier, the paint already chipped by fear. A hush fell, not silence, but the sharp intake between inhale and scream, when a drumroll thundered across the square. Soldiers lined up, muskets shouldered. At their head stood General Lafayette, tricolor sash bright against his mud-spattered uniform. He saluted Drouet, then locked eyes with Louis. The general's expression held neither pity nor hatred, only weary resolve, as though history itself had drafted him as executioner of hope. "Louis Capet," he announced, voice carrying to the farthest rooftop, "by decree of the National Assembly, you are hereby confined pending trial for treason against the French nation." He turned to the crowd. "Let the world witness that France delivers justice, not vengeance." But the mob wanted blood, not speeches. A chant began, low, rhythmic, unstoppable. Jugement, jugement, judgment. Each syllable struck like a hammer forging chains. Lafayette gestured. Soldiers surrounded the royal family, bayonets outward. Louis saw the reflection of his own pallid face in a polished blade, eyes wide, pupils pinpricks of mortal terror. For a heartbeat he imagined lunging forward, impaling himself to end the nightmare swiftly. But a shiver of cowardice, or stubborn hope, halted the fantasy. Instead he straightened, blood-soaked kerchief trembling in his grip, and allowed himself to be marched toward the palace, now his prison. Steps dragged, each footfall echoing across the square like nails driven into the coffin of monarchy. Inside the yawning portal, the air was cool, almost reverent. Yet Louis knew reverence was merely the room taking its last calm breath before the storm. He could feel a verdict forming in the streets outside, a guillotine blade sharpening on the whetstone of rage. Somewhere deep in the palace, a cell door clanged open, and Louis, once master of a kingdom, stepped into the darkness he had forged with his own fear. The cell smelled of damp straw and extinguished candles, a damp cheese odor that seeped through brick and clung to the back of the throat. Lantern glow trickled through an arrow slit high above, revealing walls so thick a man could scream until his lungs bled and hear nothing but his own echo. It wasn't the temple's infamous tower yet. That transfer would come soon enough, but this antechamber of limbo already felt carved from purgatory. A turnkey tossed down 3 stained mattresses. Lice scattered like pepper grains. The Dauphin shrank behind Marie, whose silk-soft hands now bore grime crescents under each fingernail. Louis knelt, pretending to smooth straw while actually searching for a shard of contraband hope, a nail, a loose stone, anything to prove the world could still be pried open. He found only a rat's skull, bleached and grinning, as if the dungeon itself practiced guillotine work on smaller creatures first. At midday the door scraped open, and 4 deputies of the commune filed in, red-fringed cockades bobbing like bursts of arterial spray. Their spokesman, Jean-Baptiste Billaud Varennes, unfurled a scroll covered in cramped ink. Charges for tomorrow's interrogation. Abuse of treasury. Conspiracy with foreign powers. Murder of the people at the Bastille and the Champ de Mars. Each accusation landed like hammer to anvil, sparks of panic flying off Louis's spine. Marie lifted her chin. My husband will answer when he has counsel. Billaud smiled thin as a drawn wire. His counsel is the judgment of the nation. He snapped his fingers. Guards shackled Louis's wrists with irons cold enough to numb bone. The clink echoed, a tiny preview of a blade's metallic kiss. Night fell early, smothered by soot-skinned clouds. Wind slid through the slit window, smelling of burning tallow from street processions. Somewhere beyond the walls drums pounded a heartbeat Louis could no longer control. Each boom whispered the same word, Demain, demain, tomorrow. He fumbled for prayer, but the familiar Latin phrases tangled with images of guillotines dropping in rhythmic unison, like monks tolling vespers with steel. Across the room Marie rocked the Dauphin, humming a lullaby older than Versailles. Her voice cracked only once, on the note where the song promised morning would come. A sudden scuffle. Keys rattled. The door swung wide for Citizen Simon, a cobbler promoted to jailer because he hated the smell of perfume and titled arrogance. He shoved a tin plate across the stones, gray stew afloat with unskinned turnips. Eat capet, he barked. A fat neck makes a cleaner slice. His cackle lingered even after the door slammed, as though the stones themselves had learned to laugh. Louis forced down a mouthful. It tasted of river mud and regret. Yet inside that sludge his teeth struck something hard, a tiny roll of parchment sealed in wax the color of dried violets. He palmed it, pulse spiking. When Marie distracted the Dauphin with crusts of bread, Louis unrolled the sliver beneath his shackled knees. Midnight tonight. Northwest corridor, 3 guards bribed. Cart waits by the Porte Saint-Denis. Move silent if you would live. No signature, only a smeared fleur-de-lis. A loyalist's heartbeat pulsed in that ink, or a Jacobin trap baited with desperation. Which? The rat skull grinned silently. Minutes crawled to hours. Each tick of imaginary palace clocks now echoed in his skull. At 11, torchlight flickered under the threshold, shift change. Simon's coarse laughter faded down the stair. Louis stood, chains clinking. Marie's eyes widened. What are you doing? He mouthed one word, chance. She shook her head slowly, but something fierce, the ember of a queen who once defied empires, flared in her gaze. She nodded toward the sleeping boy, then back to him. We all go, or none. Louis's pulse hammered so loud it nearly drowned the distant drums. Midnight crept closer, each second a bead of sweat on the spine of time. He rehearsed the route, northwest corridor, 3 guards, outer yard. Could he still command loyalty with no crown on his brow, no coin in his purse, only the ragged fatigue of a dethroned man? Footsteps approached, too many for a single sentry. Keys jangled, bolts shot back. The door yawned to reveal not 3 bribed allies, but 6 soldiers in blue-white National Guard coats, bayonets gleaming like frozen lightning. Behind them, Billaud Varennes held a ledger and a noose of parchment seals. His smile said he'd read the violet wax note first. Plotting again, Capet? He purred. It seems even in chains you grope for shadows to hide in. He gestured, and a guard seized the paper you still clutched. Another ripped open straw mattresses, searching for further treason. Lice and hope alike scattered. Louis's knees buckled. The Dauphin woke, screaming as cold steel brushed his mother's sleeve. Marie drew herself to full height. You terrorize children now, she spat. Is that your republic of virtue? Virtue, Billaud replied, sometimes requires pruning diseased branches so the tree survives. He turned to Louis, quill poised. Tomorrow we add escape attempt to your docket. Chains yanked, Louis stumbled. As guards hauled him toward a darker chamber, one rumored to house the rack he'd banned years earlier, he glimpsed Marie pressing their son's head to her chest, whispering a prayer that sounded suspiciously like forgive him. The door slammed, sealing the king inside a cube of stone so tight his breath ricocheted off walls and returned colder. Torch smoke stung his eyes, iron cuffs bit deeper. Somewhere beneath the floor vermin skittered. Perhaps rats, perhaps the ghosts of every peasant who starved while palace ovens baked brioche. A single question hissed louder than the rats. Can a man be brave when bravery arrives an hour too late? Outside, Paris bells began to toll one by one, converging into a dirge that shook mortar from ceilings. It was past midnight. Tomorrow had already arrived, hungry and wide-eyed. And Louis XVI, once the clockmaker king who loved intricate gears and predictable chimes, could only listen as time devoured its unloved creator. Torches sputtered along the interrogation hall, their pitchy smoke braiding with the odor of damp parchment and fierce sweat until the air tasted like burnt ink. Louis, wrists manacled to a chair that wobbled on a crooked leg, watched his breath plume in the January chill. Across the scarred oak table sat Jean-Paul Marat, skin so pallid it seemed boiled, eyes glowing feverish behind wire-rimmed glasses. Beside him loomed Saint Just, the so-called angel of death, a youth whose beauty made his cruelty gleam sharper. Ink pots, blotter sand, and a brass clepsydra occupied the tabletop like surgical tools laid out for an autopsy. Marat spoke first, voice rasping from the medicinal baths that barely kept his rotting skin at bay. "Citizen Capet, the people wish to know how many hearts you ordered stopped beating between Versailles and Varennes." He dipped a quill and waited, tip poised above a ledger thick with accusations. Louis tried to swallow, but his throat felt lined with gravel. "I never ordered bloodshed," he croaked. "I wanted only to." Saint Just slammed a fist, rattling the clepsydra. "Wanted? A king's wants are laws carved into flesh. Do not clothe murder in timidity." A door banged open. Robespierre entered, silk cravat traded for plain linen, yet his gaze radiated the chill of a sword drawn in moonlight. He carried a sheet of music, the score to Le Marseillaise, fresh from the printer and still wet with ink. He flung it onto the table. "While patriots compose anthems, you plotted with Austria. Your letters mention iron chests. What lay inside them? Austrian gold? Swiss pikes?" His tone lilted between prosecuting attorney and funeral cantor. Louis's mind flashed to the iron chest in his Tuileries study, stuffed with correspondence now paraded through Paris taverns like pornography. In those letters, he had begged foreign cousins for armies. Help, he insisted, was meant to restore order, never tyranny. But ink on paper will confess anything once stripped of context. He met Robespierre's gaze, hunting for a flicker of mercy. "None. I was deceived," Louis whispered. "Advisors." Marat sliced the air with his quill. "Always advisors, never yourself. You hide behind ministers, behind queens, behind wigs and watches." He leaned forward, stench of vinegar poultice rolling off him. "Tell me, when the mob hammered the palace gates on the 10th of August, did you hear their screams? Bread or blood? Which did you offer first?" Images crashed through Louis's head. Swiss guards cut down on marble steps, Marie's skirts drenched in powder smoke, his own voice breaking as he ordered the soldiers to cease fire. Too late, always too late. His stomach lurched, bile climbed his throat. Saint Just straightened, voice silken. "Answer the question." Louis stared at the torch smoke wreathing the rafters, searching for a prayer thin enough to slip through iron. None came. At last he murmured, "Blood found them regardless." Robespierre tapped the dripping score. "And now the nation sings while widows weep. Your cowardice tuned this melody." Marat scribbled a flourish, sealing another line of indictment. "Let the record show the prisoner confesses complicity by inaction." A gavel thundered from the far end of the hall, convention deputies watching from shadowed benches. Voices rose. "Tyrant! Butcher! Send him to the people's razor." A few shouted for deliberation, their syllables swallowed by the chorus baying for death. Robespierre lifted the clepsydra and inverted it. Sand hissed downward. Louis's final hourglass, emptied one grain at a time. "Citizen Capet, you have until the sand dies to speak words that might spare your neck. Choose them wisely." Time, the clockmaker king's old companion, now betrayed him with every falling grain. Panic fluttered like a trapped sparrow behind his ribs. He thought of the Dauphin, cheeks hollowing in the temple tower, of Marie, unraveling inch by inch under Simon's taunts, of the pocket watch he'd left behind, its engraving mocking him, Regnum Manet. The kingdom endures. But what if the kingdom abandoned its king? A memory surfaced, his coronation at Reims, where sacred oil anointed his brow and organ thunder rattled stained glass. Back then he'd sworn to protect his people. Somewhere between banquet halls and butcher shops, that oath had bled out. Could any sentence mend the fracture? He lifted his shackled hands, chains clinking like tin bells. "I beg," he began, voice trembling yet clear, "that my family be spared. Judge me, not them. Let my son grow as a farmer, unknown to courts or crowns. Let my wife find sanctuary beyond your borders. A murmur rippled through the benches, part scoff, part uneasy hum. Robespierre's eyes softened by a fraction, but Saint Just's hardened. The tree of tyranny sprouts rotten fruit. We prune root and branch. Marat dipped his quill again. So noted. The tyrant requests clemency for accomplices. The last sand grain fell. Robespierre exhaled, as if releasing a soul. This tribunal will recess for judgment. He stood, cloak swirling like a thundercloud, and, without another glance, strode out. Deputies filed behind him, their whispers trailing like funeral incense. Guard hands clamped Louis's shoulders, hauling him from the wobbling chair. As they marched him back to his cell, he glimpsed through a window slit the guillotine erected in the Place de la Révolution. Timbers dark against overcast sky, blade glinting faint dawn. Workers hammered final braces while a vendor set up barrels of vin rouge for tomorrow's crowd. Paris prepared for execution like a festival. Blood for breakfast, liberty for dessert. Back in the dungeon, Simon shoved him onto straw. Marie looked up, eyes rimmed scarlet but fierce. Well, he shook his head. They'll vote tomorrow. She brushed dirt from the Dauphin's cheek and whispered, Then tonight we teach our son how to be brave. She pulled the boy onto her lap, reciting an Austrian nursery rhyme about a knight who faced dragons without armor. Louis listened, throat tight, realizing he'd never fought any dragon except the one inside his own indecision. A distant rumble, drums or thunder, echoed through stone. Midnight neared. Simon barked lights out and slammed the door. Darkness folded around them, thick yet strangely tender. Louis stretched out on the straw, chains cold against his skin, and imagined the pocket watch ticking somewhere beyond walls, counting history's heartbeat without him. Above, bells began to toll a restless half-hour. Each clang carved deeper into the night, shaping the outline of dawn's blade. And Louis, eyes wide in blackness, knew the kingdom of France would indeed endure, just not for him. Daybreak bled across the Seine in slow crimson pulses, turning every frost-rimmed rooftop into a blade held against the sky. Inside the convention hall, braziers smoked and deputies huddled in threadbare coats, each man's vote turning to vapor before his lips. The clerk called roll like a judge naming ghosts. Barrère, death. Cambaceres, death. Condorcet, banishment. Muscles twitched across faces as tally marks clawed toward the fatal majority. 361 for execution, 360 needed. Outside, a mob thick as a plague ratcheted their own arithmetic. One head for every famine, every tax, every pipe dream strangled by palace velvet. Louis sat in a curtained alcove, flanked by two dragoons who smelled of cordite and sleepless nights. A cracked mirror on the wall gave him three reflections: king, prisoner, and something liminal. An ordinary man who suddenly understood why sinners begged for dull blades. Each time a deputy shouted "La mort," his stomach convulsed like a clock spring uncoiling. The decisive vote landed with a thud. Philippe Égalité, Louis's own cousin, rose, green scarf stark against his gray pallor, and declared, "Death without delay." Gasps whipped around the chamber. Even revolutionaries tasted acid at such betrayal. But the tally was sealed, 366. No reprieve, no appeal to the people. Louis pressed fingertips to his lips, as though the gesture might plug the leak of life seeping through these cracked minutes. January 21st, 1793. The calendar insisted it was just another Monday, but Paris shivered like a horse sensing slaughter. In the temple courtyard, the former king dressed under Simon's barked orders. Wool breeches, plain gray coat, white stockings smeared with cellar grime, clothes fit for a clerk, not a monarch, which was the point. As Louis buttoned the coat, his fingers trembled so fiercely he fumbled the last toggle. Simon slapped his hands away and fastened it himself with brutal tenderness, muttering, "We can't have the blade chasing fabric, can we?" Capuchin priest Henry Edgeworth arrived to administer final rites. Louis gripped the cleric's arm, whispering, "Tell my son, never avenge my death." The words tasted brave until he realized they might be his last command, an order to do nothing. Cowardice even now. Edgeworth's eyes shone with pity that felt like judgment. The tumbril waited outside, wheels rimed in ice, axle creaking like an old hinge. As Louis climbed aboard, a woman in the crowd shrieked, "Traitor!" and hurled a knitting needle that glanced off the priest's cassock, skittering across the plank to rest against Louis's boot. He stared at the needle, slender, harmless, yet sharper than any judgment he'd dared pronounce as king. He bent, picked it up, and slipped it into his pocket, unsure why. Perhaps a talisman, perhaps a reminder that revolution forged weapons from the humblest steel. Drums rolled. Horses strained. The cart lurched into motion down Rue Saint-Antoine, flanked by 1,200 National Guards whose bayonets flashed like winter lightning. Every window spilled curses, boiled wine, or stunned silence. A fishwife popped an oyster and spat the husk at him. A tailor extended a tape measure as if gauging where the blade should fall. Louis met none of their eyes. Instead he watched frost evaporate off gun barrels, wondered how steam could vanish faster than a rain. At the church of St. Paul St. Louis, the priest began reciting Psalm 51. Have mercy on me, O God, according to thy loving kindness. Louis mouthed the verses, but halfway through his voice cracked. In that fissure he felt the air shift, like the hush before guillotine lunette snaps shut. He gripped the cart rail until splinters bit flesh. Placed a La Revolution unfurled ahead, a dirty white sheet awaiting its wine stain. The scaffold rose 3 stories, red-painted legs splayed like a butcher's frame. Executioner Charles-Henri Sanson waited atop, leather apron stiff with old gore. He chewed parsley to mask smell of blood. The bright green against his lips was absurdly festive. Guards halted the cart. Edgeworth steadied Louis as he descended onto slush mixed with sawdust. 3 drummers hammered a tattoo meant to drown last words. Louis stepped onto the scaffold stairs, only to trip on the hem of his coat. Sanson's aides grabbed his elbows, and laughter zipped through the crowd. The king who'd once ruled 26 million souls could not climb 14 steps without help. At the platform center the priest whispered, "Courage, sire." Louis nodded, surprised to find his knees steadying. He turned to the sea of faces, cobbler, poet, whore, revolutionary, all fused into a single devouring gaze. He tried for dignity, voice pitched to reach the square. I die innocent of the crimes laid against me. I forgive those who. Sanson signaled. Drummers pounded louder, swallowing syllables. A National Guard officer galloped forth, shouting, "Silence the traitor!" Fusiliers raised muskets, as if his words alone could spark counter-revolution. Louis's last proclamation dissolved into drum thunder, unfinished like everything else he'd attempted. Aides stripped off his coat, winter-carved daggers along his spine. They fastened him to the tilting plank. One reached for a rope to bind his ankles, reflexive pride flared. He jerked back. Sanson hissed, "It's for your own safety, or the blade may hack bone twice." The humiliation stung worse than the cold. Louis nodded, and the rope cinched. The plank tilted. His face slid beneath the glittering oblique edge. Wood smelled of vinegar and meat. In his pocket the knitting needle pressed against his thigh, last remnant of a people he'd failed to mend. Edgeworth murmured, "Ascend to heaven, son of St. Louis." Louis closed his eyes, thinking not of heaven but of clock gears whirring, of bread ovens warm enough for all, of a promise never kept. The lunette clamped. Sanson yanked the lever. The blade sang a single metallic syllable, too swift for pain, yet long enough for a final cowardice. Louis wished, in that flicker between knowing and oblivion, that he had disguised himself better back in the butcher shop. A thud. A roar. Blood hissed onto sawdust, steaming. Sanson lifted the severed head, hair matted with frost and fear, and turned each cheek to the crowd. Knitting needles, tricolor ribbons, and scraps of Versailles wallpaper waved in triumph. Somewhere a trumpeter blared a cracked fanfare. Children laughed as though at a fairground marvel. Blood pooled toward the platform's edge, tracing the path of waning sunlight. January wind tugged at the king's lifeless curls, scattering droplets that cooled midair, freezing into crimson crystals before they hit the ground. The roar that followed the blade did not taper. It metastasized, rolling down the avenues like thunder that refused to quit the sky. Survivors of famine and war stamped their boots in blood-slushed snow, chanting "Vive la Nation," until their throats rasped raw. Some dipped handkerchiefs into the steaming puddle that leaked from the headless corpse, crimson souvenirs for mantelpieces that had never known mahogany or silk. Others fought for locks of royal hair, the last currency of a bankrupt dynasty, snipped while Sanson's aides shoved the torso into a wicker coffin that reeked of lime and finality. Yet for every cheer, a hush nested in the corners, an old glassblower clutching his cap, a midwife wiping sudden tears, a drummer boy frozen mid-beat because the severed head looked, for one sick instant, exactly like his father's. Liberty, it seemed, wore a mask that fit no single face. In a tavern off Rue de l'Arbre-Sec, revolutionaries toasted the execution with cups of burning absinthe. Above the din, an apprentice printer unrolled a fresh broadsheet bearing the headline. The wolf sheared, France awakes. But the compositor's ink had barely dried when rumors slipped under the door like winter drafts. Prussia massing at the frontier, Vendean peasants sharpening scythes, Jacobins eyeing Girondins for tomorrow's blade. The wolf was dead, but the forest still crawled with predators. At the Temple Tower that evening, Citizen Simon kicked open the royal children's cell. "Your father has paid his debt," he barked. The Dauphin, cheeks hollow, toy soldier gone, blinked as though awoken from a nightmare only to find it stitched to his eyelids. Princess Marie-Therese pressed a scrap of straw to her brother's lips to silence his sob, but Simon yanked it away and slammed the door, leaving the siblings with a void so large it swallowed even memory. Elsewhere, in a candlelit garret overlooking the place, a seamstress named Jean Martin threaded her last surviving needle, the twin of the one Louis had pocketed. She had hurled its mate not from hatred but from hunger, believing each steel glint might buy another day of bread. Now, staring at the empty spool, she could not decide whether she felt richer or poorer with a king's blood on her conscience. She whispered to no one, "What now?" The candle offered no reply. On the scaffold, Sanson's crew scrubbed planks with vinegar. When they pried up the board beneath the guillotine's slot, they found the knitting needle caught in a knothole, tacky with drying gore. An aide grimaced, poised to fling it away, but Sanson stopped him. "Leave it," the executioner muttered. "Let tomorrow's traitor see how simple freedom's weapon can be." He turned then, noticing a fleck of blood freezing on the blade's edge, and, for reasons he could not name, whispered an apology to the headless corpse already carted to the Madeleine cemetery. It was nonsense, perhaps, to pity a man who'd never once pitied the starving. Yet the executioner understood better than most. Steel does not discriminate. It simply obeys the laws of gravity and terror. Midnight. Paris slept fitfully, as if dreaming with one eye open. Snow began to fall, mute, relentless, erasing footprints along the Place de la Révolution until only the scaffold and its red legs remained, a dark hieroglyph against a fresh parchment of white. In a third-story window of the shuttered Tuileries, the broken pocket watch Louis had forgotten ticked on. No hand would wind it again, yet its gears still gnawed at seconds, stubborn as guilt. Inside a nearly abandoned church on Rue Saint-Honoré, Father Edgeworth knelt before the tabernacle. He laid the king's last confession, a damp scrap of vellum, beside the chalice and whispered Latin absolution over a man already judged by sharper tongues. When he emerged into the nave, the priest startled at the echo of his own footsteps. Even God, it seemed, was holding his breath to see what France would do next. From the Bastille ruins to the windswept quays, the January night inhaled the new republic like a lungful of frost. Bells that had tolled the death sentence now clanged in uncertain celebration, their peals ricocheting off shuttered houses, rattling powder from cracked frescoes. Somewhere a child awoke and asked why the sky sounded like iron. His mother, staring at the crimson reflection on the clouds, kissed his brow and lied, "Because morning is coming." And so it was. But morning would find Paris altered in ways no guillotine could finish. Hopes sharpened to razors, fears blown open like embanked furnaces, a vacuum where once a crown had glinted. Louis XVI, clockmaker, huntsman, wary dreamer, had tried to flee in borrowed wool and found only a butcher's hook waiting on the far side of panic. His cowardice, his hesitation, his final flicker of dignity, all had become fuel for fires still hungry. Snowflakes drifted onto the scaffold, hissing as they touched the stained wood, each one erasing a molecule of blood. By dawn, only the faintest rust shadow remained, a bruise on the face of history that no snowfall could fully conceal. Tomorrow the blade would rise again, perhaps for royalists, perhaps for yesterday's revolutionaries now deemed lukewarm. But tonight, beneath a wide, indifferent moon, Paris stood perfectly balanced between triumph and terror, its silence punctuated only by the metronome tick of a forgotten watch and the whisper of snow wiping the slate a deceptive white.